for Abimelech to sleep with Sarah, God calls that sinning. And Abimelech must have known, because he said that he did that in the integrity of his heart. And so the Lord says that I kept you from sinning against me. The specification of being the people of God earlier on, we read in Leviticus chapter 26, verse 3 and verse 12, where God made a conditional promise and said to them, if ye walk in my statutes and keep my judgments and do them, then in verse 12 he said, and I will walk among you and will be your God, and ye shall be my people. Now let us consider these statutes and commandments so that we see that the new people of God, will they be brought into this condition? Will they maintain being a people of God as a result of keeping the condition that God gave in Leviticus chapter 26? Now, we see the book of Exodus chapter 20 from verse 1, where we are given a case where God now speaks commandments. Where we can read the book of Exodus chapter 20 so that we just have a listing of the commandments that God spoke there. Exodus chapter 20 from verse 1, and it says, and God spake all these words, saying, I am the Lord thy God, which have brought thee out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image, or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. Thou shalt not bow down thyself to them, nor serve them. For I, the Lord thy God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children unto the third and fourth generation of them that hate me, and shewing mercy unto thousands of them that love me, and keep my commandments. Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless that taketh his name in vain. Remember the Sabbath day, to keep it holy. 6 days shalt thou labor and do all thy work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. In it thou shalt not do any work, thou, nor thy son, nor thy daughter, thy manservant, nor thy maidservant, nor thy cattle, nor thy stranger that is within thy gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that in them is, and rested the seventh day. Wherefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day, and hallowed it. Honor thy father and thy mother, that thy days may be long upon the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee. Thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's house, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife, nor his manservant, nor his maidservant, nor his ox, nor his ass, nor anything that is thy neighbor's. And now that was the conclusion of the speaking. Now, when you go to chapter 21 of the book of Exodus, then you see that God now begins another set of laws, or now these ones are called judgments. And he says, now these are the judgments which thou shalt set before them. Interestingly enough, he came down and he spoke the 10 commandments that we have read in Exodus chapter 20 from verse 1, because it said that, and the Lord spake all these words. And that follows after he has descended, and Moses has brought all the people out of the camp that they may meet with the Lord. So the 10 commandments, in distinction, they were spoken by the voice of God himself to the people, and that they were inscribed by his own finger. We read the books of Exodus chapter 24, and we read the book of Exodus chapter 31 that said the 2 tables of stone, tables that were written with the finger of God himself. So it lays emphasis that all the other laws, if you look now in the internet, or if you look into history, the Jews had nearly 613 laws, about over 600 laws. And amongst those laws, the 10 commandments are there too. But there was a distinction when Moses delivered, when in the time of Moses, there was a distinction between the 10 commandments and all the other laws. We proceed to another key difference of the 10 commandments and the other judgments and laws, were that the 10 commandments were kept sacredly in the ark. The rest were written in a book of law, and they were kept beside the ark. And we will see the book of Exodus chapter 25 verse 16, when the Lord commands the building of the tabernacle, the building of the sanctuary. then we see that he also commands that an ark be made. And what was to be put inside the ark? Exodus chapter 25 verse 16. And thou shalt put into the ark the testimony which I shall give thee. We see that the ark was to be put in the most holy place, and that the mercy seat, where the cherubims were, where the glory of God was, then that the mercy seat was put on top of the ark. And the ark was primarily made that it may house, that it may contain the 10 commandments. So the sacred nature of the ark was not because of the wood or because of the fact that it was the ark, but it was because of what it contained. It contained the 10 commandments, which were the laws spoken by God himself. So the 10 commandments were handled in a very sacred, holy, and reverential manner, aside from the other judgments and laws, because it was kept sacredly in the ark. Why were the 10 commandments regarded with such reverence, such sacredness? And that brings us to the third distinction, a difference between the 10 commandments and the other judgments, is that the 10 commandments were eternal and universal to all beings. That those were not just ones that were introduced to the Israelites alone. Those are commandments that every being in existence needed to abide by those laws and by those commandments. The rest were only introduced to the Israelites, and they did not exist any time before the Israelites. And now, let's demonstrate the existence of the 10 commandments before the Israelites. We look at the book of Genesis chapter 2 from verse 2, and one of the commandments in the 10 is speaking about keeping the Sabbath, the reverence of the Sabbath day. And in Genesis chapter 2 verse 2, it is spoken that the Sabbath was instituted at that point. And it is amazing how the commandment that was delivered at Sinai made a reference that this is not a commandment I'm giving you now. Why? In Exodus chapter 20, verse 11, it says that for in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth. And now in Genesis chapter 2, we see the institution of that, of the commandment of the Sabbath, which means it is not something that was new to the Israelites. It is something that God had ordained from the beginning of the world before Israel had come to be. And then we proceed on. We see the book of Genesis chapter 4, verse 9 and 10, where Cain kills his brother, and the Lord calls unto him and asks him, what have you done? The blood of thy brother crieth unto me from the ground. And now this points that murder, the thing that he had done by killing Abel, his brother, that was a bad thing. That was sin before God. And yet, in Mount Sinai, there's a commandment that said, thou shalt not murder. It's in essence tells us that the law saying thou shalt not murder was not new at that point. Again, we go to the book of Genesis chapter 20 from verse 1. It is a story of Abraham and Sarah. When Abraham went into the land of Gerar and met Abimelech, the king of Gerar. And then we see here that Abraham lied and said that Sarah was his sister. So that Abimelech took Sarah and went into his house with her. But then a dream, a vision comes to Abimelech. Later on, we see in verse 6, where the Lord visits him in a dream and tells him that, what have you done? You are going to be destroyed because this is someone's wife. And Abimelech says that he told me this is his sister. And now the emphasis in verse 6, where it says, in verse 6, where God says that, therefore I prevented you from sinning against me. And taking just that part, sinning against me, that is sinning against God. We know that to sin is to transgress the law. And yet that is a time when the Israelites did not exist, because that is just Abraham. And he still does not have a son. And yet, for Abimelech to sleep with Sarah, God calls that sinning. And Abimelech must have known, because he said that he did that in the integrity of his heart. And so the Lord says that I kept you from sinning against me. What I'm trying to emphasize and say here, that the 10 commandments, the speciality of them is that they were not new things that were introduced at Sinai. They were commandments that have existed from before. They were there, and they're eternally, and they're universal, and that they govern all beings in existence. So that they're not just for the Israelites, as opposed to the other judgments, which begins in Exodus chapter 21. Now, what were the continuing people of God to carry on? The Christians now, what are they supposed to carry on with? Let's look at this matter in the book of Acts. The book of Acts chapter 15 from verse 1, there was a dispute that rose. Why? Because the first Christians, who are the Jews, they did not have a problem with keeping all the other ordinances and judgments that Moses had given them, because they have been brought up in that. But then comes a problem where now we are giving our gospel to the Gentiles, people who have not been brought up in this law. And then the decision rose, and in verse 1 it says, "And certain men which came from Judea taught the brethren and said, Except ye be circumcised after the manner of Moses, ye cannot be saved." That is just the tip of the iceberg for what issue was there. And what issue was there? The issue was that the convert Jews, the Jews who have adopted the Christianity, these Jews, some of them were going out and preaching that unless the converted Gentiles come into the fold of Israel and keep all the judgments and ordinances of the Israelites, they cannot be saved. And amongst those were circumcision. And so this became an issue. And in verse 2, we are told that Paul and Barnabas, who were there preaching to the people at that point, then they decided that they should go to Jerusalem with the first apostles, with the council of the church there, that they may decide that matter. And James spoke in verse 19 and 20, saying, "Wherefore my sentence is, that we trouble not them which from among the Gentiles are turned to God, but that we write unto them that they abstain from pollution of idols, and from fornication, and from things strangled, and from blood." So it was decided that these people be given just the necessary directives that are necessary for a people of God. But then someone might have the question of, why did the apostles not write to them to keep the 10 commandments? There was no necessity of that. Why? Because in verse 21, he says that, "For Moses of old time hath in every city them that preach him, being read in the synagogues every Sabbath day." Let me tell you, as we have made a distinction of the 10 commandments and the other judgments, the 10 commandments were so sacred and they were revered universally, so that to this point, there was no need to write to the Gentiles that they are needed also to keep the 10 commandments. Why? Because it said that, "For Moses of old time hath in every city them that preach him, being read in the synagogues every Sabbath." For once, it is said there that Moses has them in every city and it is being read to them every Sabbath. The regulation that made them to meet every Sabbath day was part of the 10 commandments. And so it is evident here that the directive that are given by the apostles here, that we talk to the Gentiles, was to get them out of the other judgments and out of the other laws. There was no need that they should be told to keep the commandments, because those were paramount, mandatory, universal for all beings, for everyone who ever came into contact with the knowledge of God to that point. And so, seeing that, we see that what the Christians needed to carry on, that they maintain being a people of God, were the 10 commandments, in addition to general directives and guidelines of being a people of God. Now, we see that the 10 commandments gave a universal directive that in keeping them, someone is led into the entirety of the character of God, of being a person of God. From that point, I want us to conclude with the progress and the growth and progress of Christianity. And so, in the earlier centuries, the Christians kept this universal law, the 10 commandments. And now, shortly after that, we had the persecutions that began. And first, it began at Jerusalem, but it spread all into all the places that Christianity was growing. And the Roman Empire was at the forefront of this persecution. The official persecutions reached their pinnacle under Emperor Diocletian in 303 to 311 AD. And he was an emperor which came very strongly and brought the persecution of Christians very harshly at this point. Now, something interesting, coming to 311 AD, then a new emperor arises, that is Emperor Constantine the Great. And Emperor Constantine the Great becomes the first emperor to actually convert to be a Christian. And what that means is that persecutions ceased. In 321 AD, Emperor Constantine decreed the Sunday rest. The decree of Emperor Constantine in 321 AD was not enacting Sunday rest as a religious day of worship. It was as a day of rest for civil servants for the entirety of the empire. That Sunday becomes a day where people refrain from work, not a day where people worship. Christians essentially at this point were keeping 2 days, like they were resting both on the Sabbath day as a regulation of the law, but again, they were resting also on Sunday. That was enacted as a commemoration of the resurrection of Jesus that began earlier on there. It went on until 364 AD when the Council of the Church sat in Laodicea and they decided against the Sabbath, the seventh-day Sabbath, and where it was written that Christians should not Judaise by keeping the seventh-day Sabbath. Now, this was decided that Christians ought to revere the first day of the week, which is the Lord's Day, according to how they enacted it there, that in commemoration of the resurrection of Christ, then Christians ought to keep the first day of the week. Now, that is a big milestone because all the way from the beginning to this point, Christians have walked in the 10 Commandments entirely. But coming to this point, we are seeing a change where now in 364, then now a body of Christians, and when we say the council of the church, then it means heads of the churches came and the meeting was sat in Laodicea, and at that point, the decision was made that the seventh-day Sabbath should cease to take effect on Christians. We will discuss that later in more detail. But now this means that Sabbatarians, people who kept on moving with the seventh-day Sabbath, became heretics to the church. They became the bad people, the people who are now apparently are not walking in the precepts of God. And so we had a lot of dissension and schism began to arise. And from that point onward, we saw a lot of persecution. Now Christians persecuting those who are not obeying the laws that the church has enacted. We move again to about 610 AD. We have Muhammad arising, and from there he begins the religion of Islamism. And again, we shall discuss this in detail to see the legitimacy of that. But now this one came out as a separate group. It did not emanate from the Jews, neither from the Christians. And he said that he has received a vision and that angel Gabriel has spoke to him that the way of the Jews is false, the way of the Christians is false, and that he has been given the light, the new truth that the people of God are supposed to follow. We shall discuss that. Now let's follow the Christian line. We shall discuss the Islam line later. In the Christian line, we come to 787 AD. Another great milestone takes place here. In Nicaea, the council meets and then they ruled against iconoclasm. That is to say, veneration of images. Remember that in the 10 Commandments, one of the commandments was speaking about thou shalt not make unto thyself any graven image and thou shalt not bow down to them. But in the Council of Nicaea in 787 AD, the Council of the Church, the one that had decided in 364 AD against the Sabbath keeping, this council now again decided that there are some images that should be accepted. For example, images of the apostles and the saints, as they call them, images of Mary, the mother of Jesus, and iconism came into the church. And it is the point where now we can say that to this point, Christians were now formally observing 8 of the original commandments, 8 of the original universal laws. Because first, there was the law that was commanding rest on the 7th day. That in 364 AD, the Christians struck it out. Then they struck out also the commandment that prohibits veneration of images. And while the church would not accept and say that now we are keeping 8 commandments, the reality of the matter is that there are now 8. Why? How are you going to explain keeping the Sabbath day when you are keeping the first day and the commandment of the Sabbath was tied to the day? And again, the commandment that prohibited making images, also it is the case where the church now venerates and uses images in their worship. After that, the church went in that spirit all the way up to about the 15th. The 15th, when now Reformation began and different other people began to descend and to disagree with some of the principles and the policies of the church. And Reformation began from that point. That gave birth to different Protestant groups that have emerged even to this day. And I think to this point, we establish how the 45,000 different groups and religions have come this far that we started in episode 1. May we be blessed, and we shall continue to study this. I wish you well. I am Benjamin, and this is The Saving Truth.